The spectacle is over, but do not mistake the quiet that follows for an ending, because this is the point where the real story begins. The eclipse has already struck the match. The intention has already been spoken, or silently chosen, and now you are standing in the strange, emotional morning after still holding that wish, that promise, that private declaration, while wondering whether it can survive outside the intensity that created it. This is not disappointment, and it is not the universe withdrawing what it just offered. Tomorrow, after the moon spends its opening hours in Leo, it moves into Virgo, and with that shift, a sorting table appears in front of you. On it are three essential companions: what is actually real, what is truly driving you, and what you can practically do next. The important part is that you cannot choose the one you like best and abandon the other two. Facts alone can make you act from accurate information without understanding why any of it matters to you. Motivation alone can trap you inside endless circles of self-examination, and action alone can make you impressively efficient while moving in the wrong direction. These three only become truthful when they work together. And the uncomfortable secret is that the one in the middle is usually the one people postpone, resist, or avoid entirely. It is quieter than evidence and less satisfying than action. Yet ignoring it is precisely what allows the other two to mislead you. We will come back to that, but first you need to see what this week has already placed in front of you, because you may be carrying far more from these past days than your conscious mind has admitted. Something happened inside you this week, even if you have not found the right language for it yet. Your nervous system has already recorded the movement. Venus formed a trine with Pluto, then opposed Neptune, then formed a trine with Uranus. Desire was taken downward into emotional depth, carried into uncertainty and haze, then abruptly jolted sideways by something unexpected, and that final movement may have rearranged what you believed you wanted before your conscious story had time to catch up. While this was happening, Mercury moved through its own charged sequence, first opposing Pluto, then forming a trine with Neptune, then a sextile with Uranus. Thought itself was pulled beneath the obvious surface, softened until familiar boundaries became less distinct, then redirected toward an angle you may never have anticipated. And yesterday Mars entered Cancer, increasing the emotional volume around protection, old instincts, and the reflex to defend something before you have fully identified what actually requires defending. You may already recognize the residue of all of this in seemingly ordinary moments. Perhaps you found yourself standing in front of an open refrigerator at an unusual hour, not because you were hungry, but because your body had stopped while your mind was somewhere else. Perhaps you made a decision, dismantled it, then rebuilt it with slightly different internal supports. Perhaps a realization dropped into your chest with such physical weight that it no longer felt like an idea you were considering. It felt more like a conclusion your body had reached before your mind was invited into the conversation. That is what this week has delivered to the sorting table, and the total solar eclipse in Leo today has ignited everything already sitting there, announcing a beginning that feels vivid, intimate, and almost completely untested. What has been gathered is real, but the deeper question is whether you have examined it closely enough to know what you are actually holding, because the morning after is where inspiration meets reality. And that is where the work begins. Not every meaningful day announces itself with spectacle. Tomorrow, Thursday, the 13th, the moon begins the morning still carrying the heat of Leo, still vibrating with the confidence, desire, and emotional charge left behind by the eclipse. Then, as the day develops, the moon enters Virgo, and the emotional register changes, not from excitement into disappointment, but from expression into discernment. The beginning remains intact. Nothing is being taken away. The question simply changes. Instead of asking whether you feel the beginning, you begin asking whether the materials supporting it can actually hold. The sky is not ordering you to abandon inspiration and become painfully practical. It is asking you to place whatever the eclipse awakened onto the sorting table and let it move through several filters. The eclipse brought the harvest. The Virgo moon brings the sieves. Some of what passes through them may confirm exactly what you hoped. Some may reveal that another kind of attention is necessary. Neither result is a failure. Both give you something useful. And this transition does not happen at the first instant of the day. The moon begins in Leo and crosses into Virgo later, so the morning can still contain the warmth, certainty, and emotional conviction surrounding whatever was declared or recognized. But as the hours move forward, the lens becomes narrower. Details that were easy to skip become harder to overlook, and simply feeling that something is right stops being sufficient evidence by itself. Meanwhile, that quiet companion in the middle of the table is still waiting, positioned between the reassuring solidity of facts and the satisfying momentum of action. Asking a question whose answer may cost you something emotionally, we're getting closer to that question. But the table has to be arranged correctly first, because tomorrow offers examination rather than judgment. And that distinction changes everything. The exact aspect tomorrow is Mercury sextile. Venus with Mercury in Leo, meeting Venus in Libra, creating an opportunity for communication to find balance, for conviction in your voice to meet the instinct that understands how to speak truth without turning a difficult conversation into an explosion. Mercury in Leo naturally wants to announce, express, and make itself unmistakably heard, while Venus in Libra wants language to land with grace, to protect what matters on both sides of an exchange, and to preserve the viability of connection, even when the subject itself is uncomfortable. The sextile creates an opening to express something important attractively, without stripping it of meaning, or to say something kind with genuine honesty instead of using politeness as a way to avoid what needs to be acknowledged. Under the sky of tomorrow, this combination matters especially because another tension is operating beside it. The Sun stands alongside Mercury and Jupiter, all three in Leo. So the larger story still wants scale confidence, creative warmth, visibility, and the courage required to be seen. Leo has not completed its work. The declaration made through the eclipse is still echoing, still asking to be respected, and nothing about tomorrow extinguishes that fire. What changes is the emotional assignment sitting beside it, because the Virgo moon quietly reorganizes what deserves priority attention, shifts away from what merely impresses and toward what functions, away from what dazzles at first glance and toward what remains convincing when examined. Again, imagine the day after a major launch. The product has already been introduced. The lights have already been turned on. The excitement has already happened. Then someone sits down the following morning with the specifications and begins checking whether the internal wiring can actually support what was promised. That is the quality control atmosphere of tomorrow, and Mars, newly arrived in Cancer, adds another emotional texture, because Mars in Cancer brings protective energy that does not always understand exactly what it is protecting. Cancerian instinct can react immediately, sensing danger and reaching for a shield before the conscious mind has finished determining whether the threat belongs to the present moment or to an older memory. Beneath the sorting lens of Virgo, that reflex receives an opportunity to slow down, to identify the specific concern instead of tightening against an undefined shape in the darkness. This is why the difference between a verdict and a sorting table matters so much. A verdict closes the case. A sorting process remains open to revision. Tomorrow is not putting you on trial. It is asking you to inspect what is there. And psychologically, that difference is enormous, because someone who believes they are being judged will instinctively conceal evidence, defend a position, and protect a conclusion, while someone standing at a workbench can spread every piece across the surface and simply ask what fits, what does not, and what needs closer examination. Today's eclipse is the major event, and tomorrow does not replace or surpass it, but in the practical architecture of an actual life, in the decisions you will carry into next week and into the month that follows. This quieter and more precise day may prove more useful. The beginning has already happened. Tomorrow asks what that beginning is made from. There is no exact lunar trigger attached to the ingress, no dramatic aspect perfected by the moon at the precise moment it crosses into Virgo, so the revelation here is subtler. What changes is your mode of attention. You move from expressing the vision toward examining it, from inhabiting the feeling toward checking the seams, and this is not weaker power. It is simply power expressed differently through steadiness of hand rather than volume of voice. The difficulty is that most people want to select only one filter. They will move through tomorrow searching for the single piece of clarity that confirms what they already feel, perhaps the fact that makes a decision seem obvious. Perhaps the motive that appears to explain everything, perhaps the practical step that creates the satisfying sensation of productivity. They will choose one sieve, pour the entire week through it, and walk away believing they have achieved clarity. But the three filters are not separate options on a menu. They form one sequence. The same experience from this week has to move through all three in order, and the moment you keep only one, you have not discovered clarity, you have discovered an extremely persuasive method of being wrong. If you keep only the facts and never examine your motive, you can build a flawless case for a conclusion that fear secretly selected before the investigation even began. Every detail can be technically correct, while the direction of your reasoning remains distorted by the emotional need hiding underneath it. If you keep only the motive without comparing it with what actually happened, you can spiral inward indefinitely, analyzing yourself, labeling yourself, searching yourself, and never allowing external reality to answer any of your conclusions. And if you keep only the action without allowing it to pass through the first two filters, you may execute something with remarkable precision while aiming at completely the wrong target. One sieve always allows something through that should have been caught, which is why all three are necessary. Clarity is not simply a mood that appears when the heavens become cooperative. It is a method, something you apply deliberately, one filter after another in the proper sequence, until what remains on the other side is solid enough to plant the first. Sieve separates what happened from the story you built around what happened. And this first stage may create a physical sense of relief. You may almost feel your shoulders release when you allow it to work, because the first question Virgo asks sounds almost too simple. What actually happened? Not what it meant, not what it proves about you, not what it supposedly reveals about another person, but what literally occurred when the interpretation is removed. This becomes especially important because of the recent Neptune contacts. Venus opposed Neptune, and Mercury formed a trine with Neptune earlier this week, and those contacts can soften the boundary between observation and longing, between what somebody actually communicated and what you needed their communication to mean. Neptune does not have to deceive in order to create confusion. It can simply dissolve the hard edges until evidence and desire begin occupying the same emotional liquid, and once that happens, your mind may no longer notice where observation ends and interpretation begins. This is where Virgo brings the first practical filter. Someone did not reply to you, that is an observation. Deciding that their silence proves you do not matter is a story. The balance is lower than expected, that is an observation. Deciding that this means everything is ruined is a story. Your body has felt different recently. That is an observation. Constructing a self-diagnosis from two search results and a surge of fear is a story dressed in the authority of certainty. Separating these layers is not cold, cynical, or emotionally dismissive. It is an act of compassion toward your own nervous system, because the story usually weighs much more than the fact that originally produced it. Much of the suffering carried through this week may not have existed inside the event itself. It may have accumulated inside the interpretation placed on top of the event. Meaning was assigned before anyone checked whether the foundation could carry that meaning. And this is why the first companion at the table can make your body soften, not because facts are automatically comforting. Facts can be painful, inconvenient, embarrassing, or brutally clear, but because reality that has been named has edges, while unnamed terror can expand endlessly. The haze of this week was real, but the narratives your mind constructed inside that haze may have become heavier than the haze itself. The first gift offered by Virgo is therefore not certainty about everything. It is the reduction of unnecessary weight through the reduction of ambiguity. Go back to the original message rather than trusting the version of it that memory has rewritten under emotional pressure. Look for repeated behavior instead of building an entire conclusion from one highly charged moment. And when genuine evidence is missing, call the situation uncertain rather than converting uncertainty into a final judgment. Allow intuition to suggest the question, but then allow something observable to answer it. This does not require you to betray your instincts or dismiss what you feel. It gives those instincts a surface strong enough to stand on. And there is an important emotional shift hidden inside this process, because when you stop asking your fear to serve as evidence, you also stop forcing yourself to solve mysteries that reality has not yet answered. That can feel strangely vulnerable at first. Certainty, even frightening certainty, sometimes feels safer than admitting that you do not know yet. The Virgo process asks you to tolerate that open space long enough to distinguish knowledge from projection. The relief does not come from receiving the answer you wanted. It comes from no longer carrying conclusions that were never supported in the first place. And once that first layer is separated, something more uncomfortable becomes visible. Because facts alone cannot tell you why you selected certain facts, why one detail became enormous while another disappeared from your attention, why one silence felt unbearable while another barely registered. Why one possibility activated your whole body, while another passed through without leaving a mark. That is where the second sieve becomes unavoidable. Because the second filter separates your genuine reason from the explanation you used to protect yourself from seeing that reason. And now we have finally reached the quiet companion I warned you about at the beginning. The one positioned in the middle, the one almost everyone would rather skip. Because after you have separated reality from the story, wrapped around it, you must face what is actually motivating the story. And this is the sieve most people avoid completely. This is exactly why the other two filters can keep handing you conclusions that feel convincing while remaining impossible to fully trust. Because the missing piece is the one that asks the highest emotional price. The first filter directs your attention toward the outside world and asks what actually happened. The third points toward the future and asks what you're going to do. But the second turns the light inward and asks the question most people instinctively try to escape. Why am I really doing this? Not the polished explanation you would give a friend, not the reasonable version that makes your choices easy to defend, but the quieter force operating underneath the explanation, the motive that may never appear in the story you tell out loud. Earlier this week, Venus formed a trine with Pluto, and Mercury opposed Pluto, and that sequence brought themes of control, the desire to become necessary to someone, the fear of being left behind, and the subtle ability to disguise a strategic move as an act of generosity. None of this makes you cruel, dishonest, or bad. It simply means you deserve to understand the machinery inside yourself before you let that machinery determine what happens next. And Mars in Cancer adds another layer beneath the surface. Because what you have been calling anxiety may contain something more specific, a protective response that presents itself as urgency. An old alarm stored in the body borrowing the clothes of a present-day emergency, the kind of vigilance that makes you react before you have even identified what moved. So allow a few questions to reach the places they are meant to reach. Are you solving the problem that has actually been presented? Or are you secretly trying to manage another person's feelings about you? Does the urgency truly belong to this situation? Or has this situation accidentally awakened something much older? Are you searching for truth or collecting evidence for a conclusion you already prefer? And would you still make the same choice if you no longer needed to appear impressive, innocent, or impossible to replace that final question? Cuts deepest. And if you feel it land somewhere uncomfortable, do not rush to cover that discomfort with an immediate answer, because an answer is not the goal yet. Recognition is. You're trying to notice the motive before the motive quietly becomes the decision. And this is why people avoid the middle filter. The first requires courage because reality may contradict the story. The third requires discipline because action asks something concrete from you. But the second requires honesty with yourself, and that may be the most expensive currency you ever spend. Skip the stage and facts become evidence collected on behalf of a conclusion your unconscious motives selected in advance. Skip it, and action can become a performance of competence aimed beautifully at the wrong destination. The middle sieve is what keeps the other two from becoming sophisticated forms of self-deception. It is not comfortable, it does not move quickly, and it rarely gives you the satisfying sensation of productivity. But it is what turns sorting into genuine clarity, instead of creating a cleaner and more organized version of the confusion you brought to the table once you have allowed yourself to face that second filter, however. The third feels almost merciful because its task is warmer, quieter, and more practical. You have identified what is real. You have examined what is actually driving you. And now the question becomes much smaller than the dramatic part of your mind expected. What is the one next step that truly deserves to be taken tomorrow? Mercury forms a sextile with Venus, and this is precisely the kind of work that aspect supports. Mercury in Leo carries the conviction to speak about what matters. Venus in Libra carries the balance required to speak without creating unnecessary damage. Together they create a meeting point where communication does not have to choose between honesty and care, and beneath the Virgo moon you can hold both at once. Truth does not have to become cruelty. And kindness does not have to dissolve into vagueness. The strongest action under this sky is specific, proportionate, observable, and repeatable, not a sweeping transformation that attempts to rewrite an entire relationship in a single evening, not a dramatic confrontation delivered at maximum intensity at the worst possible moment. The Virgo step is the one whose consequences you can genuinely carry after this week is over. And today's Mars sextile Chiron contributes something important to that process, because it introduces a reparative quality, an energy that can make it easier to address a wound rather than immediately defend yourself against it. The capacity for repair is already available. The question is whether you will spend that energy on the small repair that is actually needed, or save everything for an impressive gesture that somehow never quite arrives. So the assignment here is intentionally simple, and it is deliberately not another invitation to journal or build a 3-column chart, because those kinds of tools have already been placed in your hands recently this time. Choose one fact, one number, one date, or one word. You have been avoiding only one. Perhaps it is the bank balance you have refused to check, the message you have not opened, the appointment you have not made, or the sentence you have not allowed yourself to say aloud. Then compare it with an actual record, not with your memory of it, and not with the version fear has been repeating. Look directly at the record itself. After that, take one small step based on what you discover. A genuine step grounded in something verified, checked against an honest motive small enough to complete before you go to bed tomorrow or by the following morning, yet real enough to alter the emotional weight you have been carrying through this week, because the 3 filters only become trustworthy as a complete system, and this is why you were never meant to choose your favorite and leave the table. Grain that passes through only one sieve still carries what should have been removed. You can possess a perfectly accurate fact and act on it for a completely distorted reason. You can identify your motive with extraordinary honesty while applying it to circumstances you misunderstood. And you can design a beautifully practical action that solves a problem your unconscious mind invented because solving that false problem felt safer than approaching the real one. A single filter can produce a kind of clarity that feels absolutely certain while still being wrong, but all 3 correct one another. The fact challenges the motive examines the action, and the action tests whether the fact can survive contact with reality. That is the method. And as you move away from this table, there is another distinction Virgo asks you to carry carefully. Guilt says that you are the problem. Responsibility identifies the part of the situation that you are actually capable of addressing. Shame takes an error and collapses your entire identity into it, while the sorting table does something gentler and more useful. It separates the person from the process and asks what can be improved. You are allowed to discover a weakness in your plan without turning yourself into that weakness. You are allowed to correct a document, a number, a conversation, or a boundary without deciding that the entire beginning was mistaken. Finding an error does not invalidate what started. It means the beginning is discovering what it requires in order to continue, and before you carry this forward, there is one final danger that deserves to be named. Virgo has a shadow, and that shadow is not laziness. It is anxious, scanning the temptation to treat relentless analysis as evidence that you are being responsible, searching endlessly for the single imperfection that will somehow explain everything. But that spiral has no bottom, and you should not confuse it with rigor. The purpose of this process is not total certainty. It is sufficient clarity enough, reliable information to choose the next ethical action, while leaving yourself room to revise when new evidence appears. You're building a floor strong enough to walk on beneath the intensity of this week. You are not trying to construct a flawless ceiling above it, and this may be the most important realization of all. You are the one doing the sorting. You are not the object being sorted. You are the person standing at the table with your hands in the grain, not the defect lying on the surface, waiting to be judged. This week brought intensity, uncertainty, surprise, emotional depth, and a beginning bright enough to leave an afterimage tomorrow. Simply places the sieves in your hands and asks you to examine what arrived, not because you failed, but because every honest beginning eventually requires honest editing. Feedback is an instrument, correction is a skill, and any clean answer that has not been tested through the other 2 filters is still only chaff, perhaps golden, persuasive, even beautiful, but not yet reliable enough to build upon. So take what this week has given you and let it move through all 3. Allow the facts to bring you back onto solid ground. Allow the examination of motive to humble you without turning that humility into shame. Then allow one real action to move you forward without demanding that you solve the entire future before tomorrow morning. Remember that this table is not a courtroom. It is a workbench, and your hands are the ones working with what has been gathered, deciding what remains useful and what needs to fall away. That was always the deeper purpose. Not three separate revelations offered for you to accept or reject, but one method for seeing clearly applied by your own hands at your own pace to the actual circumstances of your own week. And what you clarify now matters, because in a few days Mercury catches Jupiter in Leo, and everything you have been quietly sorting will suddenly want to become larger, bolder, and considerably louder. Pay attention to that expansion, because the version you refine now through the honest work of this sorting table is the version that will actually deserve to grow. And if something in this process reached you, notice which of these three companions you were most tempted to avoid. Then tell me in the comments, because I suspect the answers may surprise both of us. Thank you for staying with something practical instead of chasing something merely loud. And if this kind of work helps you, subscribe so the next one can find you, and I will be here when you are ready.